Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The news we have for you this week includes the first approved vaccine for the Omicron variant of COVID-19, expansion of mRNA vaccine facilities to the southern hemisphere with a first of kind being set up, a molecule that could possibly deal with up to 300 different kinds of bacteria, and those being particularly resistant to drugs. How the bacteria inside of you could actually be developing better ways to use your gastrointestinal tract to escape. One of our earliest ancestors may not have anything in common with us at all, least of all the most basic of elements. The exile of various anti-vaxxer groups from Facebook and Instagram today, and how Etsy is facilitating what can only be described as a very unusual con. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's begin with the newest vaccine that's been approved, and this comes from the United Kingdom. The vaccine is intended to specifically deal with the Omicron variant of COVID-19. Moderna's current vaccine is effective, and this is simply a development of that prior vaccine for all intents and purposes. It is, in many respects, similar to how the annual influenza vaccine is modified to make it more effective and more targeted to the current flu strain that is available. The approval does come with caveat. It is a conditional approval and only as a booster for adults. One element to this that differentiates it from the influenza vaccine is that where the influenza vaccine is targeted for each new year or new flu season, this is both a dual-purpose vaccine. That is, it targets the original strain of COVID-19 and the Omicron variant. Much of the benefit at this stage is premised on the idea that there is a significant increase in antibodies, and this has been found in investigation of titer levels of antibodies. There's up to an 8-fold increase. The questionable cloud over all of this is whether or not the serum levels of antibodies actually have a relationship to the implication of severe disease, and that is, even if you have more antibodies, will that stop the most severe cases, or will this simply be a continuation of those who aren't going to get as sick, not getting sick because they fight it off earlier, while those who are more vulnerable do get infected and are more adversely affected? Moderna's vaccine is one of 3 kinds available. You have spike proteins, which are fundamentally the same as influenza vaccines. You have DNA, and then you have mRNA. Moderna's is one of this last category, messenger RNA. Moderna is expanding their facilities now with an agreement between Moderna and one of Australia's larger universities called Monash. This university will be setting up a facility to make mRNA vaccines domestically. This is the only mRNA vaccine currently in the southern hemisphere. It will not only include the facilities to make vaccines of various kinds, but also a research and development facility. It's a quasi-national, state, and university-level cooperation with Moderna as a biopharmaceutical company. One of the benefits that has been touted by the national leader is that it removes the need to import vaccines from abroad and instead allow for domestic production. This prevents issues like supply chain disruptions and delays. Going from vaccines, which are arguably a drug of one kind, to another, that being fentanyl. This article goes into the details of what fentanyl is and why it's a problem. Notably that it is a synthetic opioid, and that it has incredible potency by comparison with other opioids. The problem with that is that it is being incorporated into other illicit drugs, and so those drugs, unbeknownst to the person taking them, are more addictive and carry more impact, let's say. This also means that because fentanyl is so potent, that even a small increase in the concentration in a drug can lead to overdose. This means that incorporating it in a ad hoc manner by questionable individuals can lead to big impact from a small amount of drug. A small amount cut into something else could poison many hundreds of people, if not killing many of those again. While we aren't going to go through all of the interview content with you, it is certainly worth a read, as it goes into a great deal of information that explains why it's not only a very beneficial drug when used in the correct way, but why it's so dangerous when used illicitly as it has been. Another drug that we want to mention this week is a relatively new drug development, and that is something that could act as an antibiotic. We are, for the most part, not at the stage where we need to panic about the availability of antibiotics. It is true that we certainly need to look into developing more and new options. Many of the current last-line options that we have, if all else has failed, can be extremely dangerous. Because of this, finding something that can be used for resistant bacterial strains is important. The new drug that's being examined is called Fabimycin, and it would be at this stage more appropriate to call it a molecule than a drug, as it's not being used medically, it's being used to test whether or not it could be used medically. This particular option is targeted at gram-negative bacteria. Bacteria generally fall into one of two categories, gram-positive, gram-negative. Gram-positive have a thick peptidoglycan wall around them. This can be targeted by things like penicillin. They punch a hole in this, and the cell wall collapses and the bacterium dies. Gram-negative bacteria don't rely on peptidoglycan anywhere near as much, and so the availability of targets for things like penicillin to interact with is greatly reduced. The other concern with gram-negative bacteria is where they tend to find their opportunities to be a pathogen. Things like the lungs, bloodstream, urinary tract, GI tract, and a few other places. Fabimycin is going to be useful not only because those who are exposed to gram-negative bacteria tend to have an unfortunately high fatality rate, it avoids many of the protections that bacteria use when dealing with antibiotics, particularly gram-negative bacteria. It avoids the necessary cell layers that protect it, and it's not compatible with the mechanisms the bacteria have to remove most treatments that are used to deal with them. This means that it can more quickly and efficiently curtail the population and prevent it from getting a strong start. And from here, by limiting the population, you can, at least in theory, avoid issues to do with the resistances you might see, and also treat the problem quicker, meaning you need less of it. The other noteworthy benefit to it, by comparison to some of the other antibiotics that are either currently being looked into or are used regularly, is that there's no known pre-existing resistances amongst bacteria to it. This means it's going to take much longer for them to develop resistance. There'll be no horizontal gene transfer from something that does have a resistance to something that doesn't. Those that will need to become resistant will need to mutate, and rapidly so, and so if used conservatively and effectively, it should be very effective for a long time. New antibiotics are great, but as is always the case, there is an arms race between pathogens and anything we have to treat them. The reality is that humans have been at war, in a manner of speaking, with pathogens forever. The environment always tries to kill humanity, and humanity fights back in one way or another. This is why the discovery of antibiotic resistance in tuberculosis bacteria is a very bad thing. Tuberculosis, or otherwise often called TB, is a very nasty pathogen. It takes a long time to treat, sometimes up to a year of daily medication. It can be vaccinated against, so there is benefits there, but if the infection avoids the immune system long enough to create infection, or you aren't vaccinated, as is the case in some countries now, it is entirely possible that you need to be worried about how you're going to treat it. This is also complicated by the fact that in less developed countries, there is a high rate of infection and it is practically endemic. If treatment in these places is yielding resistant strains of tuberculosis, and we already have up to a year-long treatment pathway, although it can be as short as 6 months, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting people to be cured of infection. And that's going to bring us full circle back to the idea that you could reinfect those who have been vaccinated because the disease is just not going away. The evidence for this comes out of research with approximately 12,000 samples from 23 countries. They tested them against a range of antimicrobials normally used for tuberculosis. More than half had a resistance to at least one of the drugs being used. More than 2,000 were resistant to the best of the drugs used for tuberculosis. There were also more than 10,000 samples that were able to deal with, otherwise known as tolerant, at a minimum and resistant at best to all 13 of the antimicrobials that the researchers were testing. Continuing evidence of the arms race between bacteria and our immune system can be found in this research article, and what they've identified is that some of the more, let's say, nasty strains of bacteria out there could be intentionally causing more health problems in order to be able to get out of our GI tract and into the environment where they can then find a new host. For example, Salmonella is one that has fundamentally evolved alongside humans. It has found ways to use our body to best benefit when trying to infect new hosts. One of the more obvious signs of Salmonella poisoning are when you begin to release the contents of your GI tract from both the top of your body and the bottom. This means that it has two pathways that it can get out and then proceed to find a new opportunity. It also happens to survive better under the conditions of fever, which your body initiates to respond to a pathogenic infection. This is where one of the mechanisms some bacteria are using comes into play. It's colloquially called leaky gut, and it would be better to say that your intestines become more permeable to bacteria, and this allows bacteria to escape out of your digestive system. At that point, they go from being your natural flora in your gut to becoming a pathogen. And that's why you can go from being otherwise healthy to, in a response to a relatively benign scenario, extremely ill. This sort of scenario where it escapes and becomes a pathogen is normally where your body would respond. What the researchers found was that in their model with mice, that the bacteria formed one of two types. One being the otherwise mundane and normal version, and this was handled by the immune system. The other was more nefarious. It found ways to survive inside the intestine's mucosal lining, thereby avoiding lymph nodes and liver once it was able to escape. Once it escaped, it could then remain hidden. By hiding, the immune system could not take care of it, and it was a much more difficult pathogen to handle. Diseases from within the body are difficult enough as it is, but then you need to look at what about diseases from outside, and COVID-19 is a perfect example of this. Unfortunately, the world has now given greater attention to these either xenotype, which is from animal diseases, or diseases that aren't necessarily coming from the environment but tend to prey upon humans. An example of this is the Langya virus, also originating in China, but from the Shandong and Henan provinces. Over the last 2 years, there's been an increased number of cases of it being a problem, with roughly 35 infections. It is related to both the Hendra and Nipah viruses, which are nasty viruses that do affect humans. As with some of the recent viruses, and in fact a lot of viruses that humans will deal with regularly, it is carried from animals to humans due to increased contact. Some of this is contact with wild animals, some from domestic animals, and some from agricultural animals. The upside to this news is that at present there is no obvious evidence of human-to-human transmission, and it would appear that most of the individuals who have been infected were infected directly from the animal source. Throwing back in time, rather than to evolution of our immune system and the arms race there, instead to one of our most ancient ancestors, practically at the single-cell stage. Well, theoretically, it's a relation to humans. It is a 540 million year old fossil from China, from a branch of the animal kingdom known as deuterostomes. These are all of your very, very basic vertebrates. Think of something like a starfish. They are about the size of the lead at the end of your pencil and have almost no traits in common with a human. One thing it doesn't lack is an asshole, and this is the truth. It's perhaps one of the major things that makes it uncommon from humans. Whether we're talking about the figurative asshole or the literal one, it just happened to have a very large mouth. That mouth performed all of its necessary functions. What has made researchers reconsider the position of its relationship to humans is what they mistook initially for paws under closer examination of a newer excavated sample were in fact small gaps between the most outer layers of its shell. These most outer layers appear to have had a role in allowing its spiny body to protrude through and thereby allow it to both prey and defend itself. This means that it didn't have paws, which helps to remove it further from the line of human lineage. Altogether, the new research has shifted its positioning into the ecdysosian part of the animal family tree, and this is where we'll eventually get invertebrates from. That means we have no relationship to it until much further back in the phylogenetic tree. In other animal-related news, we have weird US Navy experiments. They've gone and put cameras on dolphins and then watched to see what they were up to. No, this isn't Red Alert, this is actually real US Army research. Well, US Navy research at least. Which, now that we think about it, makes it even less weird. They've done some pretty crazy stuff. What the dolphins did was they went off on their merry way after having a camera strapped to them and were hunting off the coast of North America. The idea with these dolphins is that they were initially trained to try and identify underwater sea mines, and this would therefore allow America to be protected from some sort of threat. The animals weren't exactly effective in that role, but watching them once they were released did provide interesting results. Things like targeting venomous sea snakes. This has provided insight into, among other things, the feeding habits of the dolphins when they're in the wild, although this research should be taken with some caution. While the dolphins were allowed to hunt, they were also fed while in captivity. This means that it's assumed their hunting behavior is the same as a wild dolphin, but it may not be. Going from the bizarre US Army experiments to developments of a, effectively, synthetic synapse. The synapse is part of your brain that allows for processing of various signals. The synapse is where one neuron ends, then there's a gap between it and the start of the next neuron. The creation of an artificial synapse means that we could theoretically see better responses, and that's what they found here. Under, let's say, normal circumstances, your axon on one side releases its signals across the synaptic cleft. These signals eventually travel over and eventually find their receptor, thereby triggering a new response in that neuron. It is a somewhat inaccurate and time-consuming process. The synthetic or artificial synapse here differs drastically in a number of ways from the human synapse. The setup for the synapse involves the use of a number of parts. The major development in this setup is the use of an inorganic material, which is a kind of phosphosilicate glass. This kind of glass is largely inert. but it also has a silicon dioxide layer with phosphorus added to it. By using this in conjunction with a solid electrolyte, it allows for protons to pass through it at very high speeds, but also with very little energy required for it to happen. The human neuron needs at least a change of up to 100 millivolts. This uses just 10 volts. Understanding that there's a difference between how the brain structure works and how this works, but we're seeing a much higher speed for that voltage difference. The researchers describe the speed of the signal as being somewhere near instantaneous teleportation, whereas a normal cycle to move a small signal from one part of a neuron to the next is about 4 milliseconds. Admittedly, it is also at roughly 1/100th of the power. This system isn't just being used to create a fast switch though. It's designed for analog computing, which is a relatively permanent or stationary system, where once you start working with it in one particular way, you begin working on that system. It becomes unique. This is different from, say, normal processors, which can switch back to a inert state or a base state and then be rebuilt up again. You don't need to have any permanent changes occurring. The next news we have for you is a throwback to the start of the video and about vaccines, but it's the crux between anti-vaccine people and technology, specifically Facebook and Instagram. Facebook and Instagram have both taken down RFK Jr.'s accounts on the basis of spreading false information about COVID vaccines. This is not a new development. Over the last 5 or so years, we have seen increasing numbers of skeptics, alternative medical practitioners, and similar being removed from these websites and services for similar reasons. For example, those touting miracle mineral solution or trying to sell turpentine as cures for autism were purged not that long ago. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of details as to why and how the account was removed, and so at this stage, all we know is that it seems to be related to COVID misinformation, but what misinformation exactly hasn't been clear. And this is perhaps one of the biggest problems with these sorts of online services. There isn't any clear information as to what is and isn't allowed, instead it being very subjective. And even if it's not subjective, they very rarely tell you what they believe has been done incorrectly. It is this last element that may be why Etsy is allowing the various accounts on it to sell a variety of misleading and deceptive products. There's no need for them to apply the rule set they have consistently and reliably because the rules aren't set up that way. According to the article from The Insider, Etsy has a large number of accounts that are selling purported alien products that will, amongst other things, provide for intergalactic healing and protection from 5G. At least one of these we're fairly sure isn't a problem. However, we've yet to encounter an alien, so we can't speak to why you would need protection from them. The article goes into an explanation, or perhaps we should say example, of just what it is Etsy's allowing to be sold on their site. One such thing would be a 30-minute Skype session with a purported healer using technology of the Arcturians, a supposed alien species from the planet Arcturus. This person was able to gain their knowledge and skills as an intuitive energy healer when they were astrally taken aboard starships and healed from birth issues. Yeah. Remember when eBay prevented people from selling things that weren't physically saleable? This included digital products like swords on World of Warcraft, someone's virginity, other similar, highly questionable products that really weren't going to be appropriate. Why has Etsy not followed a similar a line of reasoning in their rules. This is all the more so when the listings for these items are required to include the line that reads, "for entertainment purposes only," yet people are taking them quite seriously. These are just some of the crazy things being sold on Etsy, and so we are, as said, left to wonder how and why Etsy's allowing it to go on, other than the fact that they stand to make a profit out of these pseudoscientific and nonsensical products and services. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.